It's my pleasure to welcome you today to the series of lectures by Dr. Barbara Fredrickson, entitled How Positivity Seeds Character Development, Spiritual Transformation, and Lifestyle Change. The lecture series is part of a project on religious and psychological well-being at the Danielsen Institute of Boston University, funded by the Meta-Nexus Institute. I'm Robert Neville, principal investigator of the project and professor of philosophy, religion, and theology at Boston University. Dr. Barbara Fredrickson, the Templeton Research Fellow in our project this year, is the Keenan Distinguished Professor of Psychology at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where she's also the principal investigator of the Positive Emotions and Psychophysiology Laboratory. In addition to her professorship in psychology, she is adjunct professor of management at the School of Business at the University of North Carolina. Professor Fredrickson received her BA degree from Carleton College and her PhD in psychology from Stanford University. Before coming to North Carolina, she taught at Duke and the University of Michigan, where she was also professor of business as well as psychology. She's the recipient of many awards, of which the closest to our hearts is the Templeton Prize in Positive Psychology of the American Psychological Association. Now, Dr. Fredrickson just published a book, Positivity, in 2009 with Crown Publishers. I recommend that you buy the book, several copies to give to your friends, keep at the office, keep at home. She's an extraordinarily prolific author, by herself and with others, of journal articles and book chapters. She's prolific also in winning grant money for research, which of course is the source of most of her publication. Her principal fields of research and publication are gender studies and positive emotions, and she's deeply interested in the connections between psychology and physiology. Your interest might be piqued by learning that she has published on throwing like a girl, on pride, smiling, social closeness and salivating, loving kindness, open hearts, resilience, and increasing happiness through kindness. Exactly what positive emotions are and what they do is what we're learning today from her lectures. And we'll learn more on March 20th when she returns to deliver 3 more lectures in the same kind of time scheme. Dr. Fredrickson's lectures today are entitled, this morning's lecture, Escape Self-Absorption Through Positive Emotion. Now, Open Your Heart and Flourish. And at 4 o'clock this afternoon, Let Biology Light Your Path Toward Growth. Please welcome her now to speak on Open Your Heart and Flourish. Dr. Fredrickson.
Thank you all, and thank you again for that introduction, and I like it every time. Thank you. My aim in the second lecture is to dive into the evidence for the first core idea within the Broaden and Build theory, which is that positivity opens us, that it opens our hearts and minds. And I dare say that if positivity does not include this key function, this opening of the heart and mind, then it is basically inert. That positivity without this ingredient is not going to carry forth and have its growth impact and lead to a cascade of biopsychosocial change. So this ingredient of openness is really vital to understand at a deep level. Now, we can understand the way positivity opens us in a very literal way. Now, imagine for a moment that you're this water lily. It's early dawn and your petals are drawn up closely around your face. If you can see out at all, it's just a little speck of light in front of you. But once you feel the warmth of the sun, things change. You begin to soften, your petals loosen and begin to expose your face. The delicate blinders are being removed, and as that happens, you see more and more, literally. Your world expands. Now, some flowers bloom just once, but I picked these water lilies for a reason, because they close up every evening and bloom again when they see the sun. Their openness honors changes in lightness and darkness. And what I'd like to argue is that positivity is to our minds what sunlight is to these water lilies, except the openness of our minds and hearts depends not on the warmth of the sun, but on the warmth of positive emotions. So positivity is to our minds and hearts what sunlight is to these water lilies. Now, this may all sound poetic, and perhaps too poetic, too ephemeral, and I think it's vital to underscore the science that backs this up so that we can see how this poetic language of opening with positive emotions is literally the case. And that's by looking at the research evidence to support what I call the Broaden effect, or the Broadened Hypothesis. And that is that positive emotions momentarily expand people's attention and thinking. And I'd like to start by sharing a few experimental results from my own laboratory that really first launched this area of inquiry. And then I'm going to share with you the results from other research laboratories by other scientists that have taken up this hypothesis and tested it in their own way. And those are my favorite studies these days. Those are the ones I find especially impressive. But starting with where we started with this a number of years ago, one way we've tested the Broaden effect is to bring participants into our research laboratory one by one, about 100 participants in all, and randomly assign them to experience one of 5 different emotional states. Some people experience contentment, others joy, and still others we elicited negative emotions, anger and fear, and others a neutral state. And we did this by showing short film clips that had been pre-tested to evoke these emotions. And across a series of experiments, we've looked at the effects of these momentary emotional states on the breadth of people's thought-action repertoires, as well as on the breadth of their visual processing, their global versus local visual processing. And I'll describe this measure in a moment. You can just set it aside for now. But in the first experiment that I want to share with you, where we tested the breadth of people's thought-action repertoires, what we did was simply ask people to step away from the specifics of the film you just saw and imagine being in a situation in which you yourself were feeling this emotion. And given that you are in this emotional state, what would you like to do right now? We simply asked them, what would you like to do right now? And gave them a blank page with 20 lines on it that began with, I would like to blank. Okay. And if we simply tallied the things that people listed, this is what we find. Evidence for the broadening effect, that in those people in whom we had elicited contentment or joy came up with more things they'd like to do right then. The most critical comparison is to the neutral condition. They came up with significantly more things to do right then than those who were feeling neutral. People who were induced to feel anger or fear came up with fewer things that they'd like to do right then. So we saw a narrowing effect there. So by creating positivity, we opened up possibilities. People are much more likely to jump out of their ordinary routines, their ordinary ways of approaching the world, when they're experiencing positive emotions. And indeed, other research has shown that when people are experiencing positive emotions, they are more unpredictable than when they're feeling neutral. And this is unpredictable in a good way, unpredictable in benign ways, like leaping for joy. Okay, but that you can have a better job at predicting what someone who's feeling neutral is going to do next. It's harder to know what someone who's feeling positive is going to do next. Now, we did a second experiment using those same short film clips, and again, we tested their effects on global versus local visual processing. And here's one item from a multi-item test. And the way it works is that participants are shown 3 triads of figures and asked which of the 2 bottom figures most resembles the target figure up here. You know, and of course there's no right or wrong answer. They each resemble it in one way or another. This resembles it in its global configuration, and this resembles it in its local detail elements. But when we ask people to just choose one that represents this or resembles this the most, choosing this triangle made up of triangles suggests people are seeing the big picture of this configuration. Okay. The other suggests that they're focusing on detail elements. Now, the reason we were drawn to this task in the first place is there had been prior studies that had showed personality differences in people's biases there, and that people who were depressed and anxious were more likely to select the figures that match it in its local detail elements, whereas people who are optimistic and satisfied with life were more likely to see the bigger picture. And we were wondering, if we induce a positive emotion, can we shift people's perspective, shift people's likelihood of making the choice for seeing the global configuration? And that's what we found. In another experiment, if we induce positivity, with either a short film that elicits contentment or joy, people are more likely to prefer or choose the global figure. Okay, so we can shift this ability to focus on the details towards seeing the larger configuration by simply injecting positive emotions. And we get that, the most important comparison is compared to the neutral state. Here we actually don't see a comparable narrowing effect for the negative emotions, and it could be at this study it's more, there wasn't much room to be more narrow. Now, this may seem like a subtle shift. It may seem like a shift that seems inconsequential. Again, positive emotions are very mild and very subtle, and these shifts in this openness are also very subtle. They can accumulate and compound and allow people to see the big picture, however. So, you know, here's an illustration I found that I think fits this well. Seeing the big picture allows us to connect the dots. So instead of this is just a bizarre arrangement of dots tattooed to this woman's leg, once you connect the dots, you see that she loves giraffes. Okay? Another way of looking at the way positive emotions influence thinking has been tested in studies of autobiographical memory. And within the literature on autobiographical memory, there is a very prominent idea that emotional intensity leads to tunnel memory, just like tunnel vision. You have tunnel memory. We have memory for the focal object, but we forget the details, or don't have access to the details. And yet this idea about emotions leading to tunnel memory had always been tested with negative emotions, and it had never been tested properly comparing positive to negative emotions. And so that's what these 3 scientists set out to test. And their work is admirable because they targeted a wide range of positive and negative emotions. Within the positive emotions, they got happy, calm, in love, and surprise. And so they tried to have a range of high and low intensity positive emotions. And as well, among their negative emotions, they had a range of high and low intensity negative emotions as well. And what the participants in their study were asked to do was they were given 1 minute to locate a suitable autobiographical memory with this emotional content. And then they were given 5 minutes to record all the details they could come up with about that memory. So 5 minutes to list every detail about that particular memory that they could. And then after that 5 minutes, they went through each of the details that they had come up with and rated it as either central or peripheral. So this was in a way that the participants in the study coded their own data to describe whether or not this detail makes a central difference, Could you change this detail and still have the same meaning of the situation? If you could change the detail and the central meaning of the situation would be essentially the same, then it's a peripheral detail. Okay.
What does PS mean?
Oh, I'm sorry, participants.
Okay.
So it's a, yeah, I'm sorry, that's a phrase we use in psychology to describe our, we used to call them subjects, now we call them participants. So we're becoming more enlightened.
Or PC.
That too. But I think it is good to recognize them as being involved and contributing more than being acted on. So what we learn from these participants and their stories is that the best predictor of the overall proportion of peripheral details was the valence of emotion. It wasn't the intensity, as people had suspected in the past, that where this is the percentage of peripheral details over all the details mentioned. Okay, so when people identified more of the details as peripheral details, they were experiencing a positive emotion. And again, both high activation positive emotions like positive surprise and in love, and among the negative emotions, they had the least amount of peripheral detail, especially anger. And that was a neat surprise because people always think that fear is the most narrowing of emotions, but angry, we should recognize this when we're dealing with an angry person, is that they actually have lost a lot of the details of the situation and are focused just on one piece. Okay. They were able to test in this study that it was the valence of emotions, positivity versus negativity, that affected the degree of peripheral detail in the memory. That other aspects of the memory, its intensity, its recency, and whether participants were feeling that at the time that they were recording it, they were actually reliving it. Okay, those things didn't matter as much as the valence of the original emotion. Now, you might, again, wonder, why does this peripheral detail here make a difference? And I think that it matters because today's peripheral detail might be something that becomes very central in the future. So you can think of it as living without tunnel vision. And here's one example of literal tunnel vision, where you might ask yourself, well, where are these two kids? What are they up to? With positivity, you have more of the big picture. You could say they're outside, they were playing, have their arms around each other. You have much more of the whole story and context. And it could be that that information at a later time becomes consequential. If you don't have access to it in memory, then it can't serve a function. Okay. Another experimental approach to looking at this broadening or opening effect of positive emotions has used eye tracking. Eye tracking technology is a very sophisticated camera system that locks in on the iris and judges every time the iris moves in response to what somebody's gazing at. So it picks up the amount of fixation time at any given target, as well as the direction of eye gaze. And consistent with the evidence that I've shown you about the recall of peripheral information, in studies that use visual images like this, where people are presented with pictures, there's a central picture and then two peripheral pictures. And what you find in experiments where in these experiments, they induce positive emotions in a classic way that is very powerful. You give participants a gift before the study begins, or those participants are given the same gift as a thank you afterwards. Okay, if they get the gift beforehand, they are more likely to spend time looking at the pictures all over the array. If they get the gift afterwards, meaning there's no positive emotion while they're doing the task, they spend most of their time looking at the central picture and hardly ever looking at the pictures on the periphery. Okay? So a very simple manipulation about whether you get this bag of candy. It's just a very simple treat, and they're not eating the candy, so it's not ingestion of sugar. It's very well wrapped up and tied up, so it's very clear you open this later. Okay, so these gifts of candy change the way people take in information. Now, there's a very important caveat on this finding, is that when the pictures you're looking at are neutral or positive, those results hold. If the scene that you're surveying is eliciting negative emotion, that these are disgusting or fear-provoking images, you don't get that broadening effect at all. Okay, so it's dependent on there being a benign environment. I think of that as negativity always trumps positivity. If there's a reason to feel threatened, you will. And then if you go back to that water lily analogy, if the sky darkens, that water lily closes up. And I suspect our minds are even faster to close than our water lilies. Our minds are unlikely to be, our open minds are unlikely to be sustained as open under conditions of threat. So again, here we see that how you feel fundamentally determines what you see. Okay? There could be important information in the periphery that just goes completely unseen when we are less open. I want to walk through another important experiment on testing the Broaden effect, because it's the first to have linked up two very different forms of broadening. And it targets both visual attention, as I've been describing so far, the ability to see things in the periphery, and the breadth of our semantic repertoires or our verbal creativity. So they've looked at how literally seeing the bigger picture helps people make more connections between conceptual ideas. And so one of the people in this study, the participants in this study, were randomly assigned to be in one of 3 different experimental conditions. And they used music to elicit these different emotional states. People listened to music pre-tested to be known to make people feel happy. Others listened to music that would make them sad. And others listened to a neutral soundtrack. And they tested the effects of these temporarily induced emotional states on what's called a flanker task, which I'll give you an example of in a moment, and a remote associates task. The flanker task gets at breadth of visual attention, and the breadth of semantic repertoires is captured by this remote associates task, often that goes by the acronym of RAT. So psychologists use RATs in all kinds of studies, and this is one kind. Okay, let me describe the flanker task. The participant in this study, their job is to identify as quickly as they can what is the central letter in an array of letters. Okay, it's a very simple task. They have a couple of keys on the keyboard that they need to press, but they need to do this as quickly as possible. The interest is in how quickly and accurately do people judge what the central letter is. And sometimes the central letter is surrounded by response-compatible flankers. So here the central letter is N. It could be surrounded by many N's, and so it's very easy to say N. There are 2 different conditions. The flanking letters were either close by or a little more separate. Okay, and other items on this test, it's a multi-item test again. There are response-incompatible flankers. So here you have N again. The answer is still N, but it's surrounded by H's. Okay, and the prediction, and again, near and far. The prediction is that if positive emotions broaden the scope of visual attention, then these more distant, incompatible flankers should have more of a disruptive effect when people are listening to positive emotions, because you're not tuning out the periphery. The task is to focus on the central target, and mistakes are made when you let in information from the periphery. Okay, and and so mistakes on this trial in particular shows that there's greater processing of the peripheral, unattended information, because their task is tell me the central letter. Okay, so that's the way they get at visual, breadth of visual attention. The remote associates task is very different. It has classically been used as a test of verbal creativity. It used to be required for some graduate admissions, just like the GRE, and then people discovered how whimsical people's responses are. They're actually very sensitive to people's current mood. Okay, then they stopped using it as an intelligence test. But it was a very powerful demonstration of the way emotions affect thinking to show that this task that used to be used as an intelligence, verbal fluency task, is very affected by emotions. Now, Alice Eisen did experiments on using this particular task decades ago. So it's not a novelty to use it and show positive emotions effects on it in this study. The novelty is to link the visual broadening to this semantic broadening. What single word links these three words? Does anybody?
Power.
Power. You got it. This was they gave them moderately difficult ones for this task. And that's, again, we look at the latency and whether people get it correct. Good work. You'd get into the right graduate programs. So let me walk through the data here. Now, the results were as they predicted with respect to the broadening hypothesis. Let's look at the flanker task first. This is incompatible, the effect of the incompatible flankers was much greater. It slowed down people's responses when they were feeling happy. So people would still get the answer right. It would take them longer to do so. One of the things you can conclude from here is that listening to happy, upbeat music made people worse at this focusing and just ignoring the periphery. In terms of the average number of remote associates responses that were correct, people who were experiencing the positive emotion scored higher. Okay, so one thing that's nice to know here is that a positive emotional state isn't good for everything. You know, that it has its costs and it has its benefits. Okay, so it depends on what the task at hand is. Positive emotions are not the panacea to make you better in all contexts. Depends on whether the task at hand could benefit from this broadened perspective. The flanker task can't, you stumble on it when you have that broadened perspective. This is the most compelling part of this research study I find, is that normally, under normal conditions, when people are feeling neutral, or even when they had the sad music, there is no association between people's performance on a flanker task and their performance on the remote associates. That normally those two aspects of cognitive functioning have nothing to do with one another. In the positive emotion condition, there is a correlation between them. The more people showed mistakes or slowness on the flanker task, the better they were at the remote associates task. So the ability to take in that extra information was affecting people's ability to come up with novel word associations. Now, another way to look at that is that you know, the way our brains function is very differently in a positive emotional state than in neutral or negative states. That certain capacities, visual attention and semantic fluency, which are normally, you know, just two different attributes not really related to one another, come in a line. Okay, that they're two different ways of measuring breadth of attention. My current favorite experiment on the effects of broadened attention was actually from a recent brain imaging study. It uses a very clever experimental design, which I just taught this in a graduate class, and it took me 20 minutes to get through the design features of it. So I'm just going to go to the bottom line on this study rather than go through all of the details. But the clever experimental design allowed the researchers to test whether broadening is occurring at the level of initial perceptual encoding. And what they were able to show is that positive emotions alter visual cortical filtering such that unattended information, so if you're giving people a task to focus on the center, I don't care about anything you're seeing in the periphery. If you just focus on the center, people can do that better when they're feeling neutral or negative emotional states. And the way that shows up is in the visual cortex area. Basically, the information in the periphery doesn't even make a blip in the visual cortex, okay? Because people are so good at just concentrating on the center. Now, when people are experiencing positive emotion, you can tell by regional blood flow in the brain that they are paying attention to what they see in the periphery, because it shows up in terms of greater activation of the place surround areas in the brain. Okay, so it's a way of using dynamic changes in blood flow to get beyond self-report or behavioral tasks like the flanker and say, yeah, people are actually picking up more information in the periphery. And again, this is a level of neuroimaging studies that benefits from the decades of work that we've had where people would criticize brain imaging studies because they just say, oh, what lights up when people are doing X or Y? This is the kind of work that can stand on the shoulders of that earlier work and say, okay, these areas are active when peripheral information is being processed. And now we can create experiments that allow changes in blood flow to tell us what information is being, how open the gates are to sensory information in the world around us. Okay, so this is an important extension because it shows very clearly that positive emotions are broadening perceptual encoding. We actually are taking in more of the world around us. Rumi, writing in the 13th century, captured this core idea that emotions can either close us down or open us up by saying there's a way of breathing that's a shame and a suffocation. And there's another way of expiring, what he calls a love breath, that lets you open infinitely. Okay, so we now know from these studies that this isn't just poetic language. I maybe would quibble with the infinitely part. Maybe you can't open infinitely. But there is a greater openness associated with positive emotional experiences that can be shown through a variety of sophisticated tests ranging from behavioral responses to eye tracking to brain imaging of blood flow. So the more positivity runs through our neural circuits, our veins, and our hearts, and our breath, the more open we become. And then again, we literally can take in more of the world around us. Positivity even changes the way that we connect to and relate to others. And so I want to turn now to a series of studies that really look at the social aspects of this greater openness that come with positive emotions. One way I like to put this is that in a positive emotional state, we are far more likely to think in terms of we than in terms of me versus you. Okay, we're far more likely to look past what separates us from each other, like race and cultural divides, to appreciate our common humanity. Now, one experiment that we did was very simple. We tested whether positive emotions would produce more self-other overlap. This is a way that relationship scientists have developed to measure closeness in relationships. It's a simple one-item measure where you think of yourself and another person and you indicate which of these sets of overlapping circles best represents your relationship. Now, it may seem like a very simple test, but Art Aaron, who developed it, has found that it will predict how long romantic relationships endure. So people's responses to this, seeing more self-other overlap predicts greater longevity in romantic relationships. Now, what we did in this study is have people think of their best friend. Okay, so we were using college students. We wanted to use the entire sample, so we didn't use romantic relationships, but had people think of their best friend. And before we did anything in the study, we had them indicate how close do you feel to your best friend, and they picked one of these items. And then we induced an emotion, either a positive emotion, a negative emotion, or a neutral state. And we had them complete this simple measure a second time. We actually gave it in a scrambled form with more items, so they wouldn't just recognize I picked the one on the far right, but they'd have to pick anew amongst a field of overlapping circles. And what we find is that during positive emotional states, people see more overlap, more closeness between themselves and a best friend. Okay, this isn't because of some fun time they just had with their best friend. This is just thinking about your best friend in a positive emotional state allows you to see more connection. And we've replicated this, because this experiment is so simple, we've been able to replicate it in different cultures. And one collaborator replicated it in India and another in Japan. And both of those cultures are ones in which cultural psychologists have argued there's just much more of a sense of interdependence, and people in those cultures should see a lot more overlap with themselves and others to begin with. And what I find striking is that even in these cultural contexts, if you induce positive emotions, you get more of a sense of overlap between you and a best friend. Okay. And in those studies, we used, again, film clips to elicit those emotions, but we used indigenously selected film clips from those cultures that have been pre-tested in those cultures to elicit positive emotions. So our experiments show that, again, the normally well-guarded boundaries of the self may become more permeable in a positive emotional state. So that's one way, socially, positive emotions open people up. Here's another way that we've tested this. This is one of my favorite studies done by a former student of mine, Kareem Johnson, who's now at Temple University as an assistant professor. He had the idea that because positive emotions broaden people's perceptual field and allow people to take in the whole, that should improve face perception, because it's well known that we perceive faces holistically. And in addition, there's also in face perception a very robust and reliable finding called the own race bias. And that is that people generally have poor recognition of individuals across racial lines. Now, the psychologist, scientist way to describe that is own race bias and face perception. You might recognize a bigot's description of that same phenomena is, oh, they all look the same to me. They're not able to individuate across racial lines. Now, interestingly, the own race bias has been found to be present regardless of people's experience in interracial diverse contexts. So it's not something that just disappears once people have more experience with an outgroup or another race. And so degree of intergroup contact, surprisingly, does not push that around. One suggestion is that cross-race face recognition, or the recognition of individuals across racial lines, is impaired by our quick and ready racial categorization of people. That race is such a salient social category that we're so busy dividing the world up into black, white, Asian, and other groups that we are so busy doing that we don't see the individual inside the label. Okay, and we wondered whether positive emotions might shift some of this. So here's the experiment that Kareem Johnson did for his dissertation. We had a context where white participants were learning a number of faces, 28 faces, half black, half white, very much like the images I showed you on the previous slide. We also had a between participants random assignment. Some people experienced a short video clip that would elicit joy. or amusement. Another saw a neutral clip, and still others saw a clip that would induce fear and anxiety. And next, our participants were exposed to a testing phase where they saw double the amount of faces, the 28 faces they had seen before, plus another set of 28 faces they hadn't seen before. So, and their task was simply to press a button to say, have I seen this face before? And from that, we get their accuracy, or better yet, their recognition sensitivity, separately for the white versus the black faces. And what you see here is that for the neutral state, we replicate the same own race bias effect. Remember, these are white participants seeing white faces. They're more sensitive to recognizing individuals who are of their same race compared to black faces. That difference is the classic robust own race bias finding. If you induce a negative emotion like fear, you get the same effect. There's no difference. It's equally striking own race bias effect. If you induce positive emotions by showing a short video, that effect is gone altogether. People, and the most important thing here is that it's carried by people's better ability to recognize the black faces. There's no reduction in people's ability to recognize faces of their own race. They become more open to seeing the individuals who are not of their same race. So again, it's not just like the own race bias is diminished somewhat, it's gone altogether, temporarily, because people saw an amusing film clip. I think that's pretty striking. And again, whites become just as good at recognizing black faces as they are in recognizing fellow white faces. I should mention that we get the same pattern of results when we replace black faces with Asian faces. So we found it extend across different racial groups, as well as in some studies we showed we injected the positive emotion before they ever learned the faces, and other times we injected the positive emotion after they learned the faces but before they were tested on them, and we get the same effect. Okay, so it's a pretty robust finding. Now, the social implications of this effect on positive emotions, on own race bias, I think are considerable. Imagine, consider that recognizing a person is the first step in building a relationship. You are going to hold back from connecting to a person if you're not sure that, well, is it this black person I was talking to yesterday or another one? Well, I better just hang back and not say anything. Okay, but if you can't recognize individuals, you can't go past that to forge relationships. And it may help understanding what can unlock this and dismantle this own race bias, just may help people make the most of the diverse contexts and organizations we find ourselves in, and unlock greater social and organizational capacity. And if you consider the implications for the golden rule, the love thy neighbor, the love thy enemy, and that's how it's phrased in the Charter for Compassion and in so many of these ancient religious approaches. It's phrased in the Charter of Compassion as to honor the inviolable sanctity of every human being, treating everybody without exception with absolute justice, equity, and respect. What this research tells us is that it's not easy to reach this noble goal when we're feeling rather ordinary, when we're feeling neutral. It's certainly not easy to reach that noble goal of treating others with that level of humanity and respect when we're feeling negative. But that when we're feeling positive emotions, we have a chance to achieve that noble goal of treating others as individuals with respect and humanity and dignity. Positive emotions and positive emotions more generally may be the key to allowing us to see the full humanity of others. And again, the positivity that we feel in relationship is what I would call love, an amalgam of all positive emotions experienced in close connections. And it's that amalgam that connects us to others through the heart and allows us to see others rather than ignore and walk by. Okay, I want to go a little deeper into the role of openness and truly seeing the other and its impact in relationships by describing a newer study from my laboratory. And this is work that I've done in collaboration with Dr. Sarah Aljo, one of my collaborators, who is especially invested in understanding gratitude and how gratitude works within social relationships. And it unpacks how the openness of positivity, and here that's phrased as the degree to which we're able to focus on the other, is the real engine of change within positive emotions. Like I said when we started this, is that positivity is devoid of this openness, this broadening. I think it's inert. I think it's empty. I think it's, yellow smiley faces that don't lead to anything, okay? But when positive emotion has this openness, the social openness that allows us to see the other, or the mental openness that allows us to see the big picture, that's what gives positivity its legs that help us to grow and to change. Okay. Now, in Sarah Aljo's earlier work on gratitude and social relationships, she found evidence that suggests that gratitude, expressions of gratitude, work like a booster shot in relationships. That when we're in a long-term relationship, there's some degree of adaptation that occurs, which means, just like you might adapt to the beautiful new wallpaper you decide to put up in your house, and later you don't even see it. Okay, so our long-term partners can be a little bit like that. They become part of everyday life and in the background. Okay, but what gratitude does is allows you to newly appreciate the good features of your partner that perhaps originally drew you to them, and kind of get that sparkle again. Okay, so it works as a booster shot that helps us unadapt to see our partners with fresh eyes. And the reason that this is really vital is that some scholars of gratitude have argued, well, gratitude's important, but it's only important when relationships are starting. Once relationships are well established, gratitude doesn't play as important of a role. It really helps people first identify somebody that they might trust, but then after that, it's not involved. And her research suggests that that is very off target. And I think people's intuitions about the importance of gratitude in daily life and relationships support that. The model that we developed in our research was one where this is based on a first study, which I describe as like an archaeological dig into the daily transactions of couples. And what we did was, one aspect of this study, we had about 75 couples come to our research lab, and they engaged in a number of tasks. One of the tasks that they were given was to think of something kind their partner had done for them recently, and to express their appreciation for that. So in these studies, each person in the couple had the chance to be the thanker and the benefactor. The benefactor is the phrase we use for the person who did the kind thing to begin with for this person. Each person was in each role. And the effects I'm going to describe to you held whether it was the male or the female in the relationship in that role. So the thanker identifies a kindness or a benefit provided by the other and expresses their appreciation for that in 5 minutes or less. Most people finish before 5 minutes is up, but if they don't, we gently interrupt them and ask them to move on. And after this person hears the expression of appreciation, we ask them to fill out a short questionnaire where they tell us, how responsive do you think your partner was to you? And this is a concept that's been very important in the close relationships literature. I think of it as the extent to which you think your partner gets you. Okay, so they really understood what makes me tick. They saw how much effort I put into this. They cared about me as in their expression. Okay, so people, the partners who heard the thanks indicated the degree to which they felt their partner really understood and cared for them from that interchange. So they weren't responding to this in general. It was how much were they responsive to you in what they just said, okay? And so there was a fair amount of variance in that. And then we looked at their experiences in daily life over the next couple of weeks by having them do a diary study. And in those daily assessments, we asked them how were they feeling about themselves, how satisfied they felt with their lives and their life circumstances. And we asked them also how they felt about the relationship. And we predicted that when someone expresses appreciation in a way that the listener or the benefactor thinks, they really get me, that you walk around in daily life feeling better about yourself, better about the relationship, and that feeds forward into long-term benefits for the relationship. And the long-term benefits that we measure here is that we go out 6 months later and ask them how satisfied they are with their relationship. And I want to describe to you one of the things that we discovered in this study. I want to share with you the story or the example of 2 participants who were actually in this study, and I have their permission to share their story and show their pictures here. Since I can't tell you their names, I'll call them Harry and Sally. And I'm going to tell you what Harry thanked Sally for, and then how she felt about that, and illustrate that with respect to the model. What we were surprised to discover in this study, and which is very fascinating to us, is that there seem to be high and low quality ways of expressing appreciation that are really reliably different from one another. And Harry thanked Sally in a very high quality way, and I'll describe this to you. What he decided, the kindness he decided to call out in this study was that Sally had brought to him at the end of a work day a lemon bar, or a pastry from, there was some talk in her department, and there's always pastries afterwards, and she took one aside in a napkin and brought it to him because she knows that he really likes lemon bars. And so he called out that, I really loved it when you brought me that lemon bar the other day. And, at first she's like, oh yeah, I should make those more often, or, just sort of thinking it was about the lemon bar. And he's like, no, it's not about the lemon bar. It's the fact that, in your day, you're thinking about me. And when you see something, you pull it aside and think, you can bring this as a gift for me. And, it's not just that you do that for me, you do that for everybody. You're the kind of person that thinks, how could I make other people's day brighter than it is? Okay, so he went on with this neat story about the lemon bars that really said a lot about her. And the lemon bar was sort of inconsequential in that example. Okay, so when she came away from that interchange and filled out that questionnaire, she reported very high levels of, he really got me. He understood what's important to me and why I did that. Okay. And I want to contrast that to a low quality way of expressing appreciation. And I'm not going to show you this couple, but I'll give you their story just so you can see the difference. And this was about a guitar. The man ended up saying to his significant other, thank you so much for that guitar you gave me for my birthday. I've just loved that guitar. I've been learning new songs. I've been jamming with my friends. And it went on and on and on about him and the guitar and his friends. The you was there very quickly in the thank you for the guitar, and then it was me, 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 me. Okay, so there was very little other focus in that expression of appreciation. And then when his partner responded to the perceived responsiveness after that interchange, there were lower scores. He was all about the guitar. He didn't say much about our relationship. Okay, so the reason this is an interesting difference is that there are 2 positive emotions that are at play with high and low quality expressions of appreciation. When good things happen to us, we feel joyful. A good thing just happened, this wonderful thing. I've got this great good fortune. When we see that good fortune as something somebody else cause, they went out of their way to create that good fortune for us, then we're recognizing the role of others, and that joy becomes gratitude. Okay? So what we're seeing in these examples of the low quality expressions of appreciation is they're not appreciation at all. They're expressions of joy. So you just happened to be around while I was feeling joyful. And so I'm going to tell you about it. You can think about it as how kids on holidays or birthdays, they're just so joyful to get all those presents. And their parents are directing them to thank the person who gave you the present, to focus on the others a little bit. Okay, so in a way, you see these low quality expressions of appreciation as arguably an immature way to express gratitude. Kids know that they have to say thank you, but there's a couple scholars who think, kids can't really feel gratitude because you really have to have this mental set of how people really went out of their way to benefit you. Some have argued that that doesn't come developmentally until a fair amount later. They can be joyful and they can share that joy, but it takes the moral imagination to turn it into gratitude. So again, I want to just walk through this example of what we learned with these high and low quality expressions of appreciation. When Harry thanked Sally for the lemon bar by saying how thoughtful and kind she is to him and to everybody else all the time, she saw that as, he really gets me. And then she walked around for the next couple weeks feeling better about herself, and that was predicted by this marker of quality. Feeling better about the relationship, 6 months later, feeling better still about the relationship. And again, this wasn't just a story of Harry and Sally. We did this analysis on 75 couples, and those, our marker of high quality was how it was received by the listener. And how it was received by the listener cast forward to how you felt in daily life and how you felt about the relationship 6 months later. The low quality expressions of appreciation didn't really do damage, but they didn't have this cascade. They didn't have any benefits in terms of how you feel in daily life about your relationship and how you would feel 6 months later. So it's possible they did damage, and we didn't actually measure the area of damage, but we just didn't see them providing any benefit. Okay. All right, so I want to change gears here a little bit and focus on how the openness of positivity, which we've seen can be both a perceptual openness, creative, connecting the dots openness, as well as a social openness that allows us to really see the other, to recognize the individual, whether it's a stranger and face perception, or recognizing the individual, whether it's our partner. And we're recognizing their unique ways of being in the world and the goodness that they bring. That kind of openness is what I'd argue yields growth. And I'll explain in a second why I have dice here. I think that amount of openness can function a little bit like a random act generator. Like you think of a random number generator as a way to make sure that you're being fair and including all different groups equally in your experimental designs. A random act generator would be that broadened mind that allows you to think that a wider range of possibilities, a wider range of other focuses is a good way of being. It's a way to break out of old habits and well-worn ruts, and a way of breaking out of self-absorption, to do something different, anything different, and connect to what another person, connect in with somebody else's stream of experience. And the randomness that can be associated with this kind of break out of routine, break out of the self-focus, is essential to growth. Randomness is essential to growth, resilience, and flourishing. And indeed, randomness, again, in terms of breaking out of the norm, is vital and necessary within life itself. as shaped by Darwinian natural selection. Technically speaking, reproduction is never perfect in that parents don't produce clones of themselves when they procreate. Random genetic variations sneak in that make each offspring slightly different from the parents and their siblings. And it's those genetic variations, those genetic differences that provide the energy for natural selection. Some of those variations may be harmful, could actually be detrimental. Some are completely inconsequential, but some are useful. Okay, so in this random mixing it up with the world, people stumble across all kinds of unusual actions and behaviors, and some of them, not all of them, end up bearing fruit and being useful and generative and productive. In natural selection, the helpful variations can get passed on to subsequent generations. The unhelpful ones drop out. Now, simply put, without random genetic variation, life as we know it wouldn't exist, because natural selection has to work on that variability. We need to discover new things to be able to discover which of those new things are going to be useful and generative. Okay, so I argue that the sort of do-anything spirit of positivity, or the ability to connect in with another person's stream of thought and thinking and action, is the kind of brings in that element of discovery and openness that allows us as humans to grow and change over time. That if we are less open and do everything in the same routine way, we don't grow and change over time. So that's why this openness is like this random act generator. You're rolling the dice and seeing what happens next. Rather than doing what's comfortable and routine and safe, we kind of break out and do something that's more unusual and perhaps less safe. Connecting to where another person really is and what their thoughts and feelings are isn't always the safest thing for us. But when we're feeling positive emotions, we're able to take that step. And I think it's so essential to growth and change that it's deeply tied up in whether people languish or flourish. And all living things can either languish, barely holding on to life, or flourish, becoming ripe with possibility, remarkably resilient to hard times. This is true of plants, this is true of humans. Flourishing, though, as it's been described within the science of positive psychology, goes far beyond happiness. It's true that people who are flourishing in life are happier than people who are languishing in life, but that's not the half of it. Beyond just feeling good, they're also doing good. They're also adding value to the world. And when they face hardship, they bounce back and grow even stronger. So flourishing, in a way, could be described as sort of the life instinct. It encompasses goodness, growth, generativity or creativity, as well as resilience. And it's come to represent the best of mental health, optimal mental health. Positivity and the openness that it brings, as I've been describing today so far, can help people achieve that more flourishing way of existence. I want to describe to you some of the benefits of flourishing that have been described by Corey Keyes, who is a sociologist most identified with introducing this term. He's done large-scale epidemiological studies and found that he can, if he classifies people into those who are flourishing versus those who are languishing or just moderately mentally healthy, he finds that people who flourish miss fewer days of work and they have fewer cutbacks within the work day. They also have fewer limitations on daily activities like lifting groceries and carrying groceries. They're more physically able to function on a daily basis. They have lower healthcare utilization and fewer chronic health conditions like arthritis, high blood pressure, stomach problems. And again, this is not a distinction between people who are depressed and mentally ill versus flourishing, this is a distinction between people who are kind of languishing, just getting by. They're not mentally ill, but they're not flourishing either. The people in the middle, the people who languish, their lost work days, limitations in daily activities, healthcare utilization, looks a lot closer to people with mental illness. Okay, and it's really just the people who are flourishing who really stand out and look different. So it really underscores the value of looking at mental health, not simply as the absence of mental illness. The presence of this optimal mental health is really seems to be where the action is in terms of these sorts of benefits. So I want to describe to you a study that I've done on positive emotions and flourishing to see how they're tightly connected. And what we did was target a number of groups. We oversampled people who are flourishing. Now, the epidemiological data that Corey Keyes has gathered suggests that flourishing is rather rare, that 20% of American adults would be classified as flourishing. Similarly, about 20% in their lifetime will experience depression, and that 60% in between is moderately mental healthy or could be called languishing. Okay, so flourishing is a rather rare state. So for this particular study, we oversampled people who flourished. We tried to get as many as we could by doing massive pre-testing. We pre-tested 600 people to get these 200, where the largest group was flourishing. And we compared them to people who weren't flourishing, people who were screened as being not depressed, not anxious, not substance abusers, but not flourishing either. And then as a comparison group, we also got a small sample of depressed people. And we had each of these people complete what's called a day reconstruction. So what we did was contact them on a Wednesday in July and ask them to describe yesterday in great detail. They took about an hour to describe their Tuesday. What happened on their Tuesday from when they woke up to when they went to bed. So we're calling this paper Tuesdays with Flourishers. And we were especially interested in a few targeted activities. What they do in this day reconstruction is they describe every episode, and then later they go back and say, what were you feeling during that episode? They might have broken their day into getting ready for work, commuting to work, meeting with my boss, spending some time answering emails. And for each of those episodes, they told us what emotions they were feeling and what they were doing, what activity they were doing. And we were interested in activities that were characterized by participants themselves as, I was helping somebody, or I was interacting with somebody, whether it was on the phone or in person, or I was playing, or engaging in a sport. I was learning something new. I was engaged in spiritual activity, meditation, prayer, or I was exercising. We especially were interested in each of those activities because past research shows that each of those activities yields positive emotions. So we wanted to know how these different groups of people responded in activities known to elicit positive emotions. And so our first hypothesis was that we thought that the positive emotional benefit of engaging these activities might be higher for people who are flourishing. They may get more out of these activities than others. We also measured, before and after they did this very detailed reconstruction of their Tuesday, months earlier, we measured their flourishing symptoms and facets of mindfulness, and then months later, we measured those again, and that'll come up in a moment. But again, our first question was whether people who flourish get more of a positive emotional boost from these particular activities, and that's basically what we found. I'm going to illustrate this just with helping, but we get the same basic pattern with every one of those activities except exercising. Exercising seems to not work this way, but helping, interacting, learning something new, spiritual activity are all associated with this basic pattern. And that is that no matter what they're doing, flourishers feel more positive emotions. So even when they're helping less, there's a difference. But they get a bigger boost out of helping. When they're helping more so than less so, they are experiencing greater positive. This should be labeled as positive emotions. It must have fallen off the graph. The striking thing is that we get this almost exact matching of what's going on for depressed people and non-flourishers in almost all of our figures. That the people who aren't flourishing are just as emotionally responsive or non-responsive as are depressed people. So the real action here is with distinguishing people who are flourishing. And again, this is a fairly rare state compared to people who are depressed and non-flourishing. So what we found is that for 5 of those 6 activities, again, everything but exercising, flourishers experienced more of this positive emotional boost with these ordinary daily activities. And what we did was we wanted to test next is whether these greater experiences of positive emotions, these greater positive emotion boosts of flourishers would result in more building of the cognitive resource of mindfulness over time. And to get at this, we created an aggregate variable to index the magnitude of this boost that flourishers were getting from these activities, or people were getting from these activities, and looked at how that related to changes in mindfulness over a 5 to 10 month period. And I'm going to show you a scatter plot of that next, and that along this axis we see the degree of people's positive emotional reactivity. Oh, I just ran out. Oh, there we go. And up here we get change in one facet of mindfulness, non-reactivity. Now the first thing that you notice is that these dark dots are the flourishers, these open squares are the depressed people, and these stars are the non-flourishers. Now it's an artifact of the statistical abstraction that there's a non-overlapping space between these two. So that's not the thing to notice here, although that's probably the most striking thing. The thing to notice is the positive association between, if you have more of this positive emotional reactivity, there's more of a growth in mindfulness, in this facet of mindfulness, non-reactivity, and another facet, observing over time. And that we thought was interesting because it suggested that this greater emotional reactivity was actually leading to some positive change in people over time. But what we really wanted to know was kind of, well, so what if people are changing in this aspect of mindfulness? And so we connected it back to our third hypothesis was, did this change in this cognitive resource of mindfulness actually help bolster flourishing symptoms or signs of flourishing down the road? And what we found is that if we divide up the sample into those who showed the greatest change in mindfulness, we find that those folks have the greatest change in signs of flourishing. Sometimes people react negatively to seeing symptoms of flourishing because it sounds so much like a disease, but Corey Keyes was actually really particular in using symptoms because he was trying to kind of model it after mental illness and see it as a symptom of a positive outcome. So anyway, but if you have more of a change in mindfulness, there was more of a change in flourishing. So in a way, you could see this as, again, this upward spiral of this greater positive emotionality helped people become more observing and aware and non-reactive in daily life in a way that helped reinscribe their good functioning. Okay, so it unravels the process through which positive emotions help us grow and change over time. Now I want to connect this to a quote by 20th century theologian Thomas Merton, who said, "Things that are good, and if one is responding to that goodness, one is in contact with a truth from which one is getting something." Now there's one way to look at this quote and say it is hopelessly circular. Things that are good. Okay, but another way to look at it is to see that, you know, those activities that people are involved in daily life, interacting with others, helping, learning something new, spiritual activities, those are good, they feel good. And if we open ourselves to them and extract as much of that positive emotional boost as we can, we're actually gaining something. We're building our resources. We're becoming more likely to flourish over time. So if we turn in and connect with that goodness, we're in contact with a truth from which we're getting something. And so this is what we learn from studying flourishers, that if we respond to positive events by opening our minds and hearts to them, we're getting something. Not just that boost of the day, but that boost of the day carries forward and changes who we are down the road. And if you let me return to that water lily analogy, sunlight is critical in the growth of all plants. Sunlight nourishes them. At some level, plants know this, and they turn towards the light, stretching themselves open to get as much as they can. Now, scientists call this the heliotropic effect. I think we have evidence of a similar heliotropic effect in humans. Positivity is a critical ingredient in the growth of all humans. Positivity nourishes us, and at some level we know this and turn towards the sources of positivity, stretching our minds and our hearts open to take in as much as we can. And I call this the broaden and build effect. Positive emotions quite literally open our minds and hearts and allow our lives to blossom and flourish. People who flourish seem to know this about life better than the rest of us. They seem to know it at an intuitive level, and they're the most fully blossomed among us, and we can learn from them. And just in moving on from here, I want to underscore something really vital, and this is the importance of feeling safe. Okay, that again, if you think back to that study on eye tracking, when the images were not safe, the openness collapsed. Okay, that if we want to understand why people aren't capitalizing on the experiences of positive emotion and growing and changing, we can probably most often look to situations where, you know, they're not feeling safe. Okay, they're not feeling that this is a safe place to do that. And feeling safe, and I've argued safe and satiated, are two bedrock conditions that need to be met for people to feel positive emotions. Now, I don't think safety is a matter of something that you have it or you don't. I think feelings of perceived safety shift and change moment by moment, situation by situation, and that even when people are facing difficulty, they can feel a little safety sometimes in the social support they get from others, so there's opportunities to feel positive emotions even in difficulty. But we aren't able to really take in the goodness around us unless we're feeling like the circumstance is safe. When I was looking for pictures to go with this safety notion, I walked by our spiral staircase in our house, and I saw this picture of my son and my husband. I'm like, that's it. That's what I, with that ultimate feeling of just melting into another person when you're feeling safe. So he gave me, my husband gave me permission to show this. My 10-year-old didn't, but I haven't asked yet. I don't think he would be too put out. But the last thing I'd like to do here is to reconnect this openness to an idea that I raised in the first lecture from Sharon Salzberg, which is about faith as being described as to place your heart upon something. And again, she argues that to have faith is to offer one's heart or to give one's heart over. And she likens the initial stages of faith to the exhilaration of falling in love. She talks about, she's explaining the Buddhist perspective of stages of faith. And she talks about the early stages of faith as bright faith, as a blaze, and these are her words, a blaze with glory, a glorious sense of possibility and aspiration. Okay, and that's the Buddhist term here is bright faith. And my take on this is just as love is an amalgam of positive emotions experienced in safe, close relationships, faith could be viewed as an amalgam of positive emotions experienced within a spiritual path. Bright faith is that initial joy and awe of discovering the beautiful traditions and approaches of a new faith tradition. And Sharon Salzberg writes really eloquently about how bright faith could turn into blind faith without the next vital steps, which is in the Buddhist tradition called verifying faith. Verifying faith is to deepen it by questioning, by exploring it, by verifying it against your own experience. Okay, this is the classic thing the Buddha said was, don't believe what anybody says or what I say. Check it out with respect to your own experience. And this is the step of verifying faith. And I say that this is the place where interest and exploration come in, the positive emotions of interest and exploration, turning towards the new and mysterious and trying to understand it better with respect to one's own experiences. Sharon Salzberg writes that faith is about opening up and making room for even the most painful experiences. She has this nice metaphor that she got from a musician who was sitting in retreat with her. It says, oh, we call that taking apart the chord. So instead of just hearing the chord of music, you notice each of the notes and each of the flavors in it. Okay, faith is about opening up and making room for all the different notes. Not just about seeing things in a rigid way, but really exploring what is it that I'm seeing and experiencing in a nuanced way. And she describes about how really difficult situations can help people verify their faith because they are able to take in and make room for even the horror and desolation, as well as the love and the good qualities. And there's what is a third stage of faith that Sharon Salzberg is describing from the Buddhist tradition is that on the other side of verifying faith, of being really open and exploring and connecting beliefs to your own experience, on the other side of that becomes abiding faith, is really just such a solid, firm sense of this is what I know to be true from my own experiences, and that's a product, in a way, one of the durable resources that you get from exploring and being open. Okay, so bright faith could be the initial stages of attraction. Verifying faith is the exploration that leads you to connect what you're experiencing to the tradition, and abiding faith would be that resource or the bond between you and a tradition that just is so well anchored in experience, you just kind of know it in your bones. Okay. And one of the things I thought was an interesting, certainly this verifying faith piece is also shown in other traditions aside from a Buddhist tradition. It's akin to the Jewish notion of midrash as dedication, emotional involvement, and exploration of teachings, trying to find the new in them as well, rather than taking lessons from a tradition as received wisdom that I just need to digest, exploring them with one's own heart and experience. Again, it's a way of putting your heart upon and letting that heart open you to explore and learn and build resources in oneself. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your kind attention this afternoon and take any questions. And again, if you have questions, if you can go to the mic. So.
Hi, I'm Judith Stern.
Hi.
Thank you very much. I am new to this. I haven't read your research, so what I say may not apply.
Okay.
But I was thinking about that people often get shut down in the face of anger, frustration, sadness, and maybe more open to positive feelings. They're not as scared of them, although they may be. Mm-hmm. And so I was thinking about your results, where you have, the different emotional states, maybe reflecting that shutdown, as opposed to flourishers who may be more open to all feelings, including. So it would be interesting to run those with flourishers and see what you get.
Oh, in the experiments?
Yes.
Run them with, that's a great idea. What we do know is that people who score high on flourishing also score high on valuing positive emotions, but at the same time also valuing negative emotions.
Exactly, because you can feel alive feeling any feeling.
Right.
And that's what counts.
Right. No, that's a really good point. There's something that people who flourish and people who are resilient can teach us about being able to experience the full range of emotions. But I think in doing that, an uncanny balance, not necessarily a one-to-one balance emerges, but being open to the negative experiences actually can be a great source of positive emotions and joy, which actually builds up the positive side even higher. Because if you can be open to a fear, then you can kind of let it flow through you and past you, and you don't have to kind of keep watching your back. You know, that
suffering is the gateway to enlightenment. There we go.
Yeah.
I had a thought about the individual before you ever test him or her, and what that means in the test itself. I mean, it seems to me you should want to know what the background you're looking at, what the color of this background is before you test, so you can see what responses these various impositions have on them, and then what happens to them afterwards, having imposed this on them.
Yeah, I think when and whether individuals' past histories and emotional styles come into play really depends on the question at hand when you're designing an experiment. And within experimental social psychology, the tradition is more often to randomly assign people to groups. And that random assignment allows us to temporarily disregard the individual differences between people, because we can assume that if people had a particularly negative upbringing or negative past, they'd be equally represented in our groups. And so we're able to, in those studies, learn something about how does the emotion affect the mindset. In other studies, like the ones that we did with flourishers, people who are not flourishing, people who are depressed, we're really able to get at, okay, what are the lifelong histories? How are they changing how people react to situations? And so in certain situations, in certain experimental approaches, we're really interested in that individual history. Other times we're really interested in cause and effect. And so those are research traditions that need to be merged, so that sometimes some studies we're looking at that history, some studies we're not, but we're learning different things.
Yeah. Well, then, in the studies where you're not looking at those things, are they biased if you have a group of people who is biased? I mean, if you take a certain group of people, you should have fairly biased results. You know, this whole thing of not knowing, of randomness, you don't have randomness. You have graduate students.
You're saying the sample is...
You have.
Yep. So
sampling becomes enormously important if you're not taking the background into consideration.
Right. No, that is a very fair point, that when we do studies on college students, college sophomores is our typical group for a lot of these laboratory studies, we are limiting our ability to make generalizations to different points of the lifespan, which is one of the reasons that in my more recent work I just use midlife and older adults, just because so many people are testing college students. Somebody's got to be looking at the rest of us. So but some of those places we find that the way the mind works and the way positive emotions lead to openness are similar. So I think it's good to question that, but we're also finding some places where there's a commonality. So, good point.
Hi. As I was listening to you talk about your work on broadening, the phrase ontogeny capitulates phylogeny occurred to me, and I was thinking about just what happens in the brain when people go from negative emotions to positive emotions. And it made me wonder, does positivity extend phylogeny? And I don't know if this is right because I've just been thinking about it right here. But is there a way that, we start out with these reptile brains that are kind of very medial and very ventral, where there's a lot of kind of aggression and negative emotions, and as we're able to open up more and experience more positive emotions, and cognitively broaden, we tend to use more dorsal systems like posterior parietal cortex, which is important for looking at the big picture, prefrontal cortex, which is important when we have some space between our negative experiences and our kind of more distant, experiences of labeling or mindfulness. And it just made me kind of think, I wonder if there's something about going from, these kind of deep midbrain structures upward and outward, if that's kind of a consistent theme, or if that's just, if I'm not taking into consideration, certain things. So I was wondering if that's something that you had thought about.
I think that's a really interesting connection and hypothesis to test. Again, one of the things that's known about emotion regulation is that the circuits between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala and other sections are more active in, again, labeling emotions, being aware of emotions, acting thoughtfully around them, working to down-regulate them. All that is using a lot of prefrontal cortex. Is not necessarily, most of that work has looked at down-regulation of negative emotions. There's less work that looks at upregulation of positive emotions. So that's where this work needs to go. And part of the fundamental asymmetries I talked about in the first lecture, that negative emotions are more potent and easier to see, is why we have a science of negative emotions, because they're easy to elicit in the laboratory. And it's much harder to do this with simple pictures and simple procedures with positive emotions. But people are getting more creative, holding the hand of somebody while you're in the scanner and things like that. So I do think that that's a direction that we need to understand is could broadening literally be, more blood flow in all areas of the brain, more areas of the brain at once? That's been kind of a secret, naive hypothesis of mine. I'm waiting for a neuroscientist collaborator to take that on, but that's I think as soon as we start taking seriously these events as being cognitively and developmentally important, then we'll have the science that'll be able to answer that question. So, we learn a little bit, I think, by studying meditation adepts, people who are spend their lives cultivating this. I'm much more interested in the ordinary, everyday, what's happening for people when they make these shifts, and the shifts may be subtle ones that aren't going to leap out in our data sets, and so may require a little more patience and creativity to discover. So, thanks. Good question.
Yeah, this is back maybe to the methodology aspect of your work, and I was thinking about the last experiments that you described, the high quality versus low quality appreciation experiment, and also the flourishing versus languishing measurements. And in order to get at the kinds of circular causal relationships that you're trying to measure there, don't you also, might it be important to move from languishing to flourishing to sort of investigate how that transition is made? Because, for instance, in the case of the high quality, low quality appreciation experiment, then you test later for satisfaction in the relationship, and you're trying to see, is there an assumption that the relationship quality is being reinforced by the high quality appreciation, but you don't know quite whether those are sort of two aspects of a single sort of steady state that you're getting at with different measurements. Same with the flourishing, languishing. I mean the circularity makes sense to me, but in that case, so all the more reason to want to know how do you, because you've got maybe then two circular feedback patterns, and how do you break from one to another?
Right.
And maybe that's getting out of experimental work and into therapy. I don't know.
It's it is certainly the case. I'm very interested in dynamic systems, and I'm trained as an experimental social psychologist. And there's a way in which those two are not really compatible. Experiments are really about isolating cause and effect, and randomly assigning one levels of your independent variable so you can see its effects on your dependent variable. There's a beauty in that because you can see one direction of the causal arrow, but one of the things people often forget is it doesn't mean that the causal arrow doesn't also go the opposite direction. And so I think in this broader system of positivity and emotions more generally, you've got reciprocal causality all over the place, riddled all the way through. And so that satisfaction allows people to be open and to see the other, and then seeing the other and calling that out builds satisfaction. In that high quality versus low quality expressions of appreciation study, one thing I should mention is that our end result was an increase in satisfaction. So it wasn't just that satisfied couples tend to do this, but we were predicting that satisfaction would increase. I may not have emphasized that enough. But so the ways that we can get at these upward and downward spirals is to begin to look at things as they unfold over time, and to see how levels of one predict changes in another, how changes in that predict changes in the first. This sort of like I did with the RSA and the love in that in the first lecture this morning, that they were involved in this upward spiral cycle. And that's not a typical way that experimentally minded researchers look at their data. They don't necessarily collect longitudinal data and then look at this recursive reciprocal causality without. That's not as sophisticated as being able to do dynamical analyses. And I'm getting ever more excited by the developments within quantitative psychology that'll help us look at dynamical systems in a serious way in human behavior over time. One of my collaborators is developing those techniques, and I just keep saying, I've got the phenomena for you. If you could help us bring in more sophisticated ways of looking at change over time and reciprocal causality and self-perpetuating systems. That is definitely a place where looking at the therapeutic change process through that lens would be a very compelling approach. So how do you take people who are going from struggling with depression to flourishing or doing well? There's a little bit of a clue within there's a clinical researcher named Schwartz. I think his first name is Robert, I'm not sure. But like me, he's looked at the ratio of positive to negative emotions. And it's from his work that there's just following clinically depressed individuals as they go through therapy. They show up with ratios of positive to negative emotions well below 1 to 1. A typical response to therapy brings them to about 2 to 1. And then there are people who really seem to make a drastic turnaround, and they're functioning really well in life, and they really meet the criteria for flourishing, and their ratios are around 4 or 5 to 1. So, you typically therapeutic success has been judged at if I get someone to 2 to 1. But there are some people who really take off and are really doing well in life at post-therapy, and that's the ratio, I think, helps reflect other dynamics. It's not measuring dynamics, but it's giving us little clues. And I'll talk a lot more about that on March 20th, so the sort of dynamics approach, or the way I've connected to it. So, great question.
when you're talking about the self-perpetuating nature of, say, positive emotions or negative emotions, I think the time scale seems kind of important there, because I would also imagine, and I'm not in this field, so my imagination may be wrong, that people develop habits and ways of looking at things and doing things.
Right.
And it's only at the time of experiencing a change in circumstance, a positive emotion or a negative emotion, that the shift occurs and the ensuing, probably ensuing self-reinforcement.
Right.
But come the next day or the next week, they'll probably go back to their old habits of viewing things and responding to things in a certain way.
Right.
So it would seem like both that's a challenge to look at the time interval, as well as could any of these techniques then be used to shake loose these habits of thought and feeling, and thus be able to work on oneself more effectively.
Yeah. I want to put in a plug for my third lecture of today, because I think I'll address that question some. But I think it raises this fundamental feature of emotions, is that they are our reactions to perceived changes in our environment. So that when something changes, we feel an emotion. And if in the absence of such anything that we perceive as a change, we often don't feel anything. That emotions are evolved wisdom of responding to changing circumstances. Now, that view, though, can lead people to think that, emotions just rain down on me like the weather. If I have bad fortune, I have negative emotions. If I have good fortune, I have positive emotions, without really recognizing that the key shifter is whether we perceive ill fortune or good fortune. And once we realize that that is a choice we make in every moment, as to whether we construe of our current circumstances as good fortune or not, we can actually do quite a bit to unlock more positive emotions. We could also do quite a bit to unlock more negative emotions. We could walk around all the time and think, what's wrong here? Who's to blame? And just fill ourselves with negativity and negative emotions by consequence. So it's kind of like that mental talk that we have is something that that stream of chatter we have in our minds determines our emotions so much. I mean, there's nothing new to that. That is the base of cognitive behavioral therapy, is that our thoughts are leading to our actions. But I think our emotions, a lot of us think that emotions just happen, that they really aren't something that we get to steer. So in the third lecture of today, I'll describe some studies where people are getting training in how to steer their emotions more towards genuine positive emotions, and to see what happens with that.